In early January, oil tankers began leaving Venezuelan waters with their transponders turned off. No signals, no identity, just massive ships disappearing into the dark. That is never a technical accident. When ships go dark, power is already shifting. I've spent decades studying geopolitics, and here is a hard truth. Oil does not move quietly unless the rules are being rewritten. What looked like smuggling was something far bigger. A test of sanctions, a test of force, a test of who still decides what is legal in the global economy. Within days, US forces intercepted vessels. Marines boarded tankers before dawn. A long-standing dictator was captured. And suddenly, Venezuela's oil was no longer a national resource. It became a geopolitical prize. If you want to understand how power truly works in 2025, this is where the story begins. Stay with me, because beneath the surface, a much deeper question is already forming. In early January, oil tankers began slipping out of Venezuelan waters with their transponders turned off. No signal, no name, no visibility. That is not a technical failure. When ships go dark, it means power is being contested. I've followed global politics for decades, and I can tell you this: oil never moves in silence unless the rules have stopped working. What looked like routine smuggling was something else entirely. A system under strain, sanctions being tested, authority being challenged. Then came the response. US forces intercepted vessels at sea, Marines boarded tankers before dawn, one ship was seized, another was released. And soon after, Venezuela's longtime dictator was captured. In a matter of days, the conversation shifted. This was no longer about Venezuela's sovereignty. It was about control, security, and who decides the fate of sanctioned oil. If you want to understand how power really operates in 2025, this is where it begins. Stay with me, because the real story is only starting to surface. So let's slow this down and define the problem clearly. This is not just a story about oil tankers or naval patrols. It is about what happens when sanctions collide with reality. Venezuela is one of the world's most oil-rich countries. Yet for years, its crude has been locked behind restrictions, shadow markets, and political isolation. The tankers that left Venezuelan waters were not acting randomly. They were responding to pressure. A US blockade imposed in mid-December, limited legal buyers, and an economy desperate to move its only valuable asset. At the same time, Washington's position was shifting. Enforcement was no longer passive. Ships were intercepted, cargoes were seized, and for the first time, military power was used openly to police energy flows in the Caribbean. What we are seeing is a transition from sanctions as policy to control as practice. And once that line is crossed, the logic of the entire system begins to change. To understand why this moment matters, we need to look backward first. To understand how this moment emerged, we need to look at the system that produced it. For years, Venezuela's economy revolved around one asset, oil. But sanctions fractured that model. Official exports collapsed. Legal buyers disappeared. And the country was pushed into a parallel economy where crude moved quietly through intermediaries, reflagged vessels, and opaque routes. This is how shadow oil markets are born. Not out of secrecy, but necessity. When formal channels close, informal ones take their place. Tankers sail without transponders. Ownership becomes layered. Flags change. Accountability dissolves. At the same time, US policy hardened. A naval blockade was imposed in mid-December. Monitoring intensified. The message was clear. Sanctioned oil would no longer simply be discouraged. It would be physically stopped. These forces collided in January. A fragile system met hard enforcement. And when that happens, history shows us one thing. The first crisis is never the last, because pressure always reveals where a system is weakest. And that weakness was about to surface. The first rupture came quietly. Then all at once, In early January, a flotilla of tankers left Venezuelan waters. Some were fully loaded, others were empty, positioned to receive cargo. Nearly a dozen ships moved out despite the blockade, many with their transponders switched off. This was not chaos. It was calculation, but the system did not hold. One supertanker was intercepted by U.S. forces. Another vessel was seized in a pre-dawn operation. Marines and sailors boarded at sea. Flags were checked. Cargoes examined. Authority was asserted. One ship was later released. Others turned back. And suddenly, the shadow market was exposed to daylight. This moment mattered because it changed behavior. Ships that had pushed forward reversed course. Vessels returned to Venezuelan waters. The risk equation shifted overnight. If you're finding this analysis useful, pause for a moment and stay with me, because moments like this rarely stay isolated. This was not just enforcement, it was a signal, and signals travel fast in global energy markets. What followed was not confusion but adaptation. And that leads us to the mechanism beneath the crisis. To understand what really happened, we have to look beneath the surface. This was not simply about stopping ships. It was about redefining control. Sanctions alone rely on compliance, but compliance only works when alternatives are limited. In Venezuela's case, shadow routes had kept oil moving despite restrictions. What changed was enforcement. By intercepting tankers at sea, the United States shifted from economic pressure to physical authority. Naval power replaced paperwork, Marines replaced warning letters, and energy flows were no longer regulated by markets, but by security guarantees. At the same time, a new offer emerged. After the capture of Nicolas Maduro, U.S. officials spoke openly with oil executives. Safety was promised, security was guaranteed. Investment was encouraged, but under new terms. The message was unmistakable. Oil would move again, but only through approved channels and under direct oversight. This is how systems are reset, not through declarations, but through leverage. When risk becomes too high, actors realign, ships turn back, deals change hands, control consolidates. And once that mechanism locks in, the consequences reach far beyond one coastline. The second shock was already forming. The second crisis did not unfold at sea. It unfolded in plain sight. Days after the tanker seizures, nearly 24 oil executives were invited to the White House. Names that dominate the global energy system: Chevron, Exxon, Shell, Trafigura, Vitol, companies that understand risk better than anyone. The message they received was radically different from the one tankers had faced offshore. You have total safety, total security. The president made it explicit. Companies would not deal with Venezuela. They would deal directly with the United States. Venezuelan oil would be extracted, sold at market price, and its proceeds controlled to ensure they benefited both Americans and Venezuelans. This was not diplomacy. It was restructuring. At the same time, reports emerged that between 30 and 50 million barrels of sanctioned oil would be turned over. The shift was complete, from isolation to integration, from punishment to management. This moment mattered because it collapsed uncertainty. Investors saw clarity, markets saw enforcement, and Venezuela's oil stopped being a liability. It became an asset under supervision, and when that happens, the consequences don't stay at the top. They move downward. Now, let's bring this down to where it actually lands. With you, when oil becomes a geopolitical asset, everyday life absorbs the shock. If you live in Venezuela, decisions made in distant rooms suddenly determine whether salaries stabilize, whether fuel moves, whether the economy breathes or tightens again. You are not part of the negotiations. You are part of the outcome. Security guarantees sound abstract, but they decide whether ships return or turn back, whether investment flows or freezes, whether shadow markets fade or survive. And every one of those shifts affects prices, jobs, and stability. Even outside Venezuela, you feel it. Energy markets ripple, supply expectations change, governments adjust policies, and inflation quietly responds. If this matters to you and it should stay engaged, share this analysis. Think beyond headlines, because these systems shape your future whether you vote on them or not. This is why power is never just about leaders or corporations. It's about how control travels downward. And next, we need to see how far those effects really spread. What began off the coast of Venezuela did not stay there. Oil is a global language. When its flow is interrupted, rerouted, or controlled, the signal travels fast. Tanker movements are watched worldwide. So are seizures. So are guarantees of security backed by military power. For energy markets, the message was unmistakable. Sanctions are no longer just legal barriers. They are enforceable realities. And that changes how states and companies calculate risk far beyond the Caribbean. For oil-producing nations under pressure, this moment set a precedent. Shadow trade is no longer invisible. Naval enforcement can reach further. And political isolation may end not through negotiation, but through restructuring under external control. For allies and competitors alike, the implications are sharper. Control over energy routes translates directly into leverage, economic, diplomatic, and strategic. When one power demonstrates it can police supply, others take note. This is how regional actions become global reference points, not through speeches, but through behavior. And once that reference point is established, the world begins to adjust around it. Which leaves us with the hardest question of all. What comes next? From this point forward, three futures are possible. The first is stability through control. Oil production resumes under tight supervision, investment flows in, security guarantees hold. Venezuela's energy sector is reintegrated into global markets, but sovereignty is limited. Order returns, but it is conditional. The second future is friction. Enforcement remains uneven, shadow routes adapt, political resistance grows beneath the surface. Oil moves, but uncertainty lingers. The system functions, but never fully stabilizes. And then there is the third scenario. Breakdown. Control is challenged, guarantees fail, competing powers test the boundaries. Energy once again becomes contested, not just economically,